Welcome to Discovering the Law. My name is Lucy Rivera and I am your host today. This episode can be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com. And today we're going to talk about a very important issue in today's economy. They're raising interest rates and what that means. And for that, we have an expert in the field, Rene Jarquin, Chief Investment Officer at Single Point Partners. Rene.
Hi, Lucy.
Thank you for coming today.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Rene, please tell us define inflation. What is it?
Inflation is really a very simple concept. It's really the idea that the cost of living, the cost of buying a basic basket of goods and services for households, primarily, it tends to go up over time, and inflation is a way to capture the rate at which that basket of goods and services costs.
So what are some of the contributing factors of inflation?
Well, I would say, in an economy like ours, which is primarily a service economy, right? Whether it's the business that operates a taqueria service, or maybe it's a logistics company like FedEx that ships packages on behalf of shippers and Amazon. In this kind of an economy, labor is the biggest component of a company's cost base. So if the price of labor to produce that service is going up, then typically the price of that service to the end customer will also go up with it. So labor is a big component in an economy like ours, right? The price of labor.
And what is the impact on interest rates?
Sure. No, that's a very timely question, right? Because there's a very direct correlation between the level of interest rates and the level of inflation, which is the rate at which this basket of goods and services increases every year. So the higher the inflation, the higher the interest rate. And similarly, on the other side, if you have a very low rate of inflation, then the economy usually will tolerate a very low level of interest rates.
And so inflation also has an impact on commodities. Tell us what commodities are and tell us what the correlation is.
Sure. So commodities is a kind of a catch-all phrase to describe things like oil, copper, so physical inputs that are needed to manufacture and produce the goods that we consume, right? Probably the most famous commodity is energy, the price of oil. And because it's such a universal input and it affects so many industries, when the price of oil goes up sharply, you tend to see it at the pump when you fill up your car, but it also affects a lot of other shippers and trucking and airplane operators, airlines, and so forth. That's perhaps the most common or well-known commodity, but there are many others, including aluminum, steel, which have recently been the subject, obviously, of some discussions about placing tariffs on imports of foreign aluminum and steel. And as the price of commodities goes up, that's an input that filters down or cascades down into the final end user prices of the finished products, right? So in some ways, the tariffs that are currently being discussed would tend to have an inflationary effect in the economy.
And what about consumer prices, producer prices?
Sure.
What's the impact on that?
Sure. So commodities, as I've indicated, tends to increase the cost to source raw materials to produce a good, whether or not a company, say a manufacturer of LEDs, of flat panel display televisions, whether they're able to pass on that higher cost to source that raw material to the end user in whole or in part depends upon the competitive dynamics and a series of other factors. But typically, they'll be able to pass along at least a portion of that. So as commodities goes up, both the intermediate as well as the final end user prices can be expected to also rise.
Now, you talked about wages, so talk about employment, unemployment, and what happens.
Right. So we've been in a period, the last 10 years, where there has been a fairly significant amount of slack in the U.S. labor market in aggregate, right? So if you look at metrics like the unemployment rate, or the underemployment rate. You'll see that coming out of the Great Recession in the spring of 2009, the summer of 2009. You'll see that, we had a lot of people that were idle. It was a very difficult time for a lot of households. A lot of folks lost their jobs. A lot of folks couldn't, had to work part-time because there wasn't enough full-time employment. As a result of some of this dynamic, a lot of folks left the labor force as well. So through the years, it took a long time to use up all that kind of excess labor that was idled as a result of the Great Recession. And during that time period, what you saw was hardly any wage inflation. You saw hardly any raises. You saw hardly any increases in average hourly wages. So it was hard on a lot of families, right? Because that means family budgets were tight, and people had to, really think very carefully about how to spend the family dollar. We're now at a point in the economic cycle where the unemployment rate has really dropped dramatically relative to where we were 5, 10 years ago. There's not a lot of idle workers anymore. And so as a result of that, you're beginning to see more people getting raises. You're beginning to see wage inflation, and tighter labor markets means greater competition for workers. And that's very good for workers. You want there to be a lot more demand for workers than supply, because that means everybody makes a little bit more.
And so today we are talking to Rene Jarquin, who is Chief Investment Officer at Single Point Partners. And Rene, so what is the role of the central bank in this arena?
So the central bank has a dual mandate, The central bank has a dual mandate in the US, which is to maintain price stability. And that's basically code for making sure that the inflation does not run either too hot or that it doesn't run too cold, meaning that you get deflation, like what happened in Japan. And I can expand upon that a little bit more.
Oh, yes, sure.
So what happened in Japan over the last 20 years is a very unique phenomena where instead of price inflation, you have price deflation, meaning every year that basket of goods and services in Japan for a Japanese household gets just a little bit cheaper. And it's a phenomena that has taken place slowly, gradually, and that it has now become entrenched in the mindset of many households. As a result of that, interest rates on offer. So if you go to a bank in Japan and you want to open up a CD or a savings account, you will hardly get any sort of interest on your deposits. And again, it's a reflection of the fact that there is not only are prices not increasing there, but you actually are seeing some deflation.
So when this happens, can inflation be managed?
So I think you want to think about inflation as kind of like a thermostat, like a cup of coffee. It can't be too hot, you can't drink it, and it can't be too cold. It's not enjoyable, right? So the job of the central bank is to make sure that inflation stays within a certain band, okay? And in the U.S., luckily, we don't have today a problem around deflation. We flirted with deflation coming out of the Great Recession in 2009 and 10, where there was a lot of slack in the system, not just here, but also in Europe and Asia. But we're now at a point where inflation is now gradually moving up, but it's doing so at a very slow pace. But it is ultimately the central bank's responsibility to make sure that the economy does not overheat to such an extent that inflation begins to gallop at a faster pace, right? As a matter of social policy, as a matter of public policy, it is not recommended that the inflationary kind of byproduct of a hot economy to curtail or reduce the purchasing power of households, right? Households at the end of the day have to feel like their dollar is going farther, and when inflation gets a little bit out of control, you have a dynamic where, you could have social instability, you could have some difficulties there.
What would be some economic indicators of the fact that there's going to be inflation?
Well, both the Department of Labor and the Commerce Department both publish different metrics of that, price index. And that's perhaps the most common, the most popular way to measure inflation is this basket of goods and services that's captured through this surveying and sampling method across all the major regions of the economy. But there's also the other key component of inflation, which is wage inflation or inflation in the cost of labor. And in observing that, what you see is when the economy heats up, you start seeing people jumping to different, pursuing better deals, working for other companies. You see companies, in order to not lose their best people, you see companies beginning to preemptively give higher bonuses, give retention bonuses, give raises in a way that you wouldn't see it when there's an imbalance, right? When there's a lot of supply of labor, right, and less demand for it. So those are some of the things that you would be looking out for, right, to determine whether or not there's that inflation is picking up, right?
So to that vein, what happens to the value of money during inflation?
So inflation over time, inflation erodes the value of money, right? It reduces the purchasing power of that $1. The best example I give is the year I was born in 1970. I think you could buy a brand new car for $2,500. Today, you couldn't buy a brand new car for less than $30,000, right? It happens very gradually, but it's real. And the purchasing power of people's earnings, of people's paychecks, has to be preserved, and that is why, as a matter of public policy, we want some inflation, but not too much.
So what causes the value of money to go up and down?
So the price of money, right, is in economics, the price of money is captured by the interest rate. So interest rate, the higher the interest rate, makes borrowing money a more expensive proposition, right? So whether it's buying a home, right, taking out a mortgage to buy a home, if you're a household, or buying a factory or installing a new software system if you're a business, right? Those are big capital outlays. Your ability to do that is much easier to the extent that you can borrow from the banks or from the bond market at relatively low interest rates over long periods of time, right? So there's this other impact, right? That if inflation is too high, then that will directly translate into more expensive or higher interest rates, and the cost to borrow and to make these big capital outlays, right, for these big ticket items becomes more difficult. And unless companies do so, find it profitable to do so, unless households find it also less attractive to buy a house when the cost of money is very high. So that's another reason why, as a matter of policy, it's better to keep interest rates at a level that is not too high, right?
So April 2018, what is the status of the economy in far as interest rates? Do you see a trend as to where they're heading?
Yeah.
Whether we're heading to inflation? How do you describe this period?
Yeah, I think we're going from a period of very low inflation, abnormally low inflation, right? Consider that up until the Great Recession, if you had looked at the prior 30 years, the typical or average inflation was somewhere between 2.5% to 4 or 5%. There was an abnormally high period in the late 70s, early 80s when it was 6-7% per year. That was not the norm. And then the period after the Great Recession where inflation dropped down to 1%, 1.5%, that was also abnormally low. So I think we're normalizing, and I think we're now getting to a point where, maybe we're looking at 2%, 2.25% over the course of the next couple of years, right? Which is really the kind of the Fed's target, the central bank's target, which is not too hot, right? Not too cold, and that's where we are going. We're not there yet, right? There's still some slack in the labor market. Some folks might dispute that, but our view, my view is that there's still some slack in the labor market. So it'll take maybe a couple of more years before we get to a point where inflation is pushing up, closer to 3%, right? And that would force the central bank's hand to to take some actions to raise interest rates.
So would you agree that we are entering a period of inflation?
Well, we've always had inflation, so the question is whether we're going to a more normal inflationary level. I think we are going into a more normal inflationary level. That doesn't make it unhealthy. In fact, I would argue that an inflation rate of 2.5% is something that you would want. It's desirable because it typically occurs only in the presence of an economy that is firing on all cylinders, where many geographic regions and industries are growing and investing and absorbing a lot of labor into that economy, and therefore creating a lot of economic growth and well-being and prosperity for households and businesses, which is what we want.
But now you talked about 1.5, 2.5. Give us a scale, and just if you could describe when you say inflation is, you want it at this certain target. Who sets these targets?
Yeah.
And
The inflation target is set by the Federal Reserve, right? That's the highest monetary authority in the country. Some would argue in the world, the most important central bank in the world, and they have come out and defined their target inflation rate to be 2%. For one of the metrics, the Department of Commerce metrics, which is the core personal consumption expenditures index. I don't want to get too wonky or too technical, but that metric right now is running at about 1.6, 1.7% annualized. And that metric, they want it to get to at least 2 and to stay there, right? Not just to go up there for a couple of months and then come back down. They're willing to let the economy run its course, gradually raise interest rates a little bit from very, very low levels, right? And hopefully let inflation take its course within the confine of that target. And that is, I think that's going to be achievable given that, I don't think we're at risk of a situation like the late 1970s where we had, it's a very different kind of an economy, but we had 6-7% per year inflationary impulse back then, and that was problematic for many reasons. We're not even close to that.
now, Rene, you are referring a lot about low interest rates in the past. Now, tell us, why was that in response to, what does that cost? Why was that necessary, the situation, and how come it's changing?
You're saying back in the 70s?
Back in the, when we had the financial crisis in the 2008, 2010,
Right.
when the interest rates. So if you could describe what
Yeah.
gave rise to that, what is that in response to, how come it maintained the rates the way they were, and
So what the dynamic of what occurred in 2008 with the Great Recession was really a collapse in demand. So many businesses and many households at the same time found it to be a better decision to defer big ticket purchases. There were many people that were laid off, many households that could not spend money, and the households that had money would not spend money. And similarly, kind of that mindset took over in the business, within the business community. Why that happened, I mean, that's probably another hour of discussion. But in a nutshell, we had a near collapse of the banking system, right? And with the near collapse of the banking system, credit dried up completely. And when credit dries up in an economy, you see that kind of behavior of hoarding and of not wanting to part with your cash, right? And so when that happens in big enterprises, in big companies, big business, and it also trickles down to households, you have a situation where you have too much supply of labor, not enough demand, many people get laid off, and it's a cycle that kind of feeds on itself. And when you have that kind of slack in the system, right, you get deflation, and you get too many goods, not enough demand in different markets, but the labor market being the critical one. And that was really the one that really did us in as an economy back in 08 and 09.
that needed to be fueled, and that's why the interest rate.
Right. I mean, so the Fed dropped interest rates as a way to stimulate, right, to offset some of that, mentality to pull away and to not, invest and spend money.
Yes. So now that, what is your perception of the trend that we are hearing about?
Yeah. So I think we're in a very different place now. I think, looking back, it's been almost 10 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which was really the catalyst, right? That was the fuse that lit the Great Recession. And we're in a very different place. The banking system is very well capitalized. It's very liquid. It's very healthy. Credit is flowing. Credit is flowing now to parts of the economy that it wasn't flowing to even 3 or 4 years ago. Some of that has to do with some of the deregulation that we're seeing. Some of that has to do with the fact that there are, animal spirits have come back, right? Taxes have been reduced, right? We can debate whether or not, tax policy is good or not, but clinically speaking, purely from a macroeconomic perspective, kind of the first order effect of a big tax cut like the one we just had is to make, owners of companies and managers of companies and even of households to feel more confident and want to spend more, right? So the economy is in much better shape, and we're seeing growth, and we're seeing a pickup in growth, and it's frankly, it's very exciting, I think.
Can I ask you to just expand on that?
Yes.
You just said the tax break that we just recently saw for the
Yes.
big companies.
Yes.
Did you want to describe a little bit as to what that is, what
Sure.
that means, what that does, and the impact?
Sure. So the tax reform that was passed in December had two components to it, a corporate and individual. So the business taxes were cut pretty dramatically. The nominal tax rate for businesses was dropped from, I think, 35% to 21%, which is a massive cut. It is a huge windfall if you operate a corporation or a business or a small partnership. So it's a lot more money in your pocket, right? Or available now for investment, in staff, investment in software, investment in expansion, right? And that's very good. The second component of the tax reform was a modest reduction in the marginal tax rates for individuals, for households. There were some deductions taken away, but there were some tax rates that were dropped as well. But the net effect of all that is that for most people, they're going to see a tax cut as well. And, everybody likes to have a little more money in their pocket, right? And so we think that was also a very good, a good contributor to, the reawakening of confidence and of wanting to go out and spend, on big ticket items.
So we have 2 minutes left, but do you feel that this will trickle down to the small business owner, and also how is the impact as far as the gradation of individuals? How is that really going to affect me and you when we file our taxes?
Yes, most definitely. It will affect us as individuals. And I'll tell you, look, the small business sector in this country is probably the biggest jobs creator. In some ways, there's a misconception that, the biggest job creators are the big Fortune 500 companies. I'll tell you that most of the big Fortune 500 companies, in the aggregate, probably close to half of their labor forces are outside of the US. They've been the ones that have outsourced a lot of production, right? But the small businesses that are here, obviously, that's not so much of an option for them. So I think, yes, for sure. I think you can expect to see small business confidence to rise. We're already seeing it. And you're going to begin to see expansion, even among the small business owner population.
Well, Rene, we actually ran out of time, but it was really interesting to have you and for the conversation about interest rates. And for all our viewers, you can see Rene Jarquin at www.discoveringthelaw.com, or also here at BNN. My name is Lucy Rivera, and really thank you for your time.